Sterling Armory is not a big name in the sword collecting hobby. Until last year, I personally had not even heard of them, and it seems to me that they're still flying under the radar. It's high time for that to change. Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and welcome to another sword review. Today the focus will be on this Sterling Armory sword. I bought this sword from Sterling Armory at Combat Con last year for $770 US, and I commissioned the Scabbard from Steven Huerta for approximately $450 US. Sterling Armory is based in Tampa, Florida, and is primarily run by Chris Fields. He's the main bladesmith, and he focuses on swords inspired by historical designs, although he has started branching out into some fantasy. The sword I'm reviewing today was made by Mr. Fields. Also working at Sterling Armory are Josh and Thomas. Josh tends to mostly do hilt work, sometimes on swords that Mr. Fields made, sometimes on production swords such as the Hanwei Tinker line. He tends to like more fantasy inspiration for his swords. Thomas is relatively new to Sterling Armory, and as far as I can tell, he's acting kind of like an apprentice to Mr. Fields. The sword I'm reviewing today is not a replica or reproduction of any specific historical find. Rather, it's inspired by several, including this beautiful sword from the Wallace Collection. The Sterling Armory sword is representative of an oakshot type XVIIIa sword, which was a cut-and-thrust balanced hand-and-a-half sword that saw most of its use from the mid-14th to early 15th centuries. Some of these swords, like the famous Brescia Spadona, have a short fuller, but it's not a requirement of the type. They feature either a flattened diamond cross-section, like the Sterling Armory sword, or a hollow grind. XVIIIa swords typically have a grip that's just long enough to fit a second hand, something that's a little uncommon in reproductions these days. Most modern hand-and-a-half swords tend to have longer grips than is historical. So let's get into the meat of this review, starting with the Scabbard. As I mentioned, I commissioned it from Steven Huerta, who, like Sterling Armory, is based in Florida. I asked him to make the Scabbard in a vine-themed design, with a suspension system that would make for easy carry, and a green to match the grip. I think the vine pattern is beautiful, and while the green is ever so slightly different than the grip, it's only noticeable when looking really closely. Personally, I think Mr. Huerta nailed the looks here. It's a beautiful scabbard that really complements the sword very well. Fit-wise, it's perfect. There's no rattle and the perfect amount of retention. The suspension works beautifully as well. Without having any idea of how to wear it, I was able to get it nicely secured and wearable very comfortably. Mr. Huerta did provide a video about how to wear it as well. Moving on to the hilt, the pommel is kind of a fishtail design, with clean lines and a shiny finish. Every possible edge has been chamfered and rounded nicely to prevent any kind of hot spot, which is pretty important for this sword. With the grip being as short as it is, using it in two hands requires gripping the pommel, so making it this comfortable to hold was a very good call. Being that Sterling Armory is based in Florida, and that a lot of their customers are also in that extremely humid environment, they use stainless steel for their hilt furniture to reduce maintenance requirements. I personally appreciate the thought here, since keeping pommels and crossguards from developing any rust is pretty difficult, even when you live near the desert in Southern California, as I do. The peen here is ground smooth, although it's pretty rough in appearance. It's rather jagged and nowhere near the clean, round peens you'll see on swords from other makers in this price range, such as Albion. Mr. Fields mentioned to me that this style of pommel makes it difficult to evenly shape the peen, so most manufacturers just smooth it out until it's barely noticeable. But he prefers this style, as it's what he's seen on the historical swords he's examined. In any case, it does the job of holding the hilt together very well. The grip is simultaneously one of my favorite parts of this sword, and also the source of my biggest complaint. For the good, I absolutely love the shape. It's a rounded rectangle near the guard, and it wastes in towards the pommel, making for an excellent feel. Indexing the blade is easy, and I love the way it feels in the hand. Except for one spot, where the seam in the leather meets the riser, right here. It's not egregious, but there is a bit of a hot spot here. When I swing the sword with this spot in my hand, it rubs against my skin in an uncomfortable manner. It's not painful, and simply reversing the sword so my fingers are against the spot removes the problem entirely, but I do notice it when I use the sword. I could probably fix this by burnishing it a bit, and it's honestly a pretty minor complaint, which I guess is something of a spoiler about the conclusion of this review, since I already said this is the biggest issue I have. The crossguard has quite a bit of geometry to it, with a hand-ground look that's not quite symmetrical, which I happen to appreciate. The lines are all clearly defined, and the decorative embellishment at the ends of the quillins brings a bit of looks to what at first glance is a pretty plain guard. It's obvious that, like the pommel, Mr. Fields paid special attention to ensure there's no sharp edges on the guard. Everything is smoothly chamfered to prevent any kind of discomfort. The gap in the crossguard is astonishingly small. The fit to the blade is superb, something that I imagine is helped by the fact that the sword blade is mostly rectangular here. Still, this is some excellent fit and finish work. Moving on to the business end, the blade. Here's the measurements I took of the sword. The relatively short blade, just over 32 inches, wouldn't look out of place on a single-handed sword, but it does work well here, making it what I consider a perfect riding sword. It starts a little over 7mm thick, featuring a flat hexagonal cross-section for about 2 inches, much like the Vision Tauber I reviewed recently. It also has a relatively thick ricasso. These two features are present on just about every Sterling Armory sword I've seen. In terms of distal taper, it thins pretty rapidly after that hexagonal section, and ends in a reinforced tip that is more reminiscent of an 18B than 18A. Here you can see the vibration nodes on this sword. This is something that Mr. Fields pays close attention to when making his swords, ensuring the resonance makes for effective, painless use. The pivot point in the grip is exactly where I want it to be, for both one- and two-handed use. I can flex the blade some, but really only towards the tip. The rest of the blade is nicely stiff. The finish is a satin with some tool markings visible, and a rough, unpolished look to the ricasso. The tool markings might have been caused by some repair work Mr. Fields did on the sword after it got damaged in transit when having the scabbard made. I'm not quite sure how it happened, but there was a gouge on the surface of the blade. I showed a picture of it to Mr. Fields, and he offered to fix it if I shipped it to him, a gracious offer that I accepted. I honestly don't remember if any of these tool markings were visible before this, but in any case, they don't bother me. I will say that the overall look of the sword is a bit more modern than what Albion offers. I think it has more in common with Angus trim swords in terms of aesthetics. The cross-section of this sword is a stout, flattened diamond, and the edge geometry is excellent. It's one smooth grind all the way to the edge, which is quite sharp. There's little asymmetries here and there, especially towards the point, but overall it works out quite well. When it comes to handling, the sword is balanced just under 4 inches, and it feels great. With one hand, it has authority in the cut without being awkward or unbalanced, and with two hands, it's an absolute joy to wield. I love how light and nimble it is while still being able to deliver good cutting power. And before moving on to that test cutting footage, let's compare this sword to a couple others. Alright, so let's do a comparison of my Sterling Armory sword with a couple other that I think are fairly comparable. So right off, this is a short blade, quite nimble, feel like I always have good control of where it's going. Maybe not there. I'm not very good at this. But it's a very nimble blade. Just enough authority in the cut. I really like it. Next up is another 18A sword. This one could also be an 18B. It's kind of up in the air. This is the Balor Arms 15th century Italian longsword. And I definitely have a little bit less tip control here. It's still pretty good, I think. It's definitely a bigger sword, much longer grip, much worse fit and finish, of course, since it's a much less expensive sword. Some people have problems with this sword being whippy. Mine is not that at all. Back to the Sterling Armory sword. Yeah, not whippy in the slightest. Lastly, we have an Albion Squire Line Bastard sword. This is a relatively new acquisition for me that actually I'm going to be trading relatively soon, because I just picked up the Albion Mercenary, which is basically the higher end version of this sword. This is a 15A, and I'm using it, and I pulled it as a comparison because it's also got a relatively short grip. It's very much a hand and a half sword, a lot like the Sterling Armory. Again, not whippy at all. Good tip control. I feel like the Sterling Armory I might have a little bit better. That also just might be the fact that I am not used to doing this. And my shoulders and arms are already starting to feel a little fatigued. And now, on to cutting. Overall, I think it cut quite well. One thing that's really nifty about this sword is the sound. I've never used a sword that rings so clearly when I execute a cut well. And when I flick it, well, listen for yourself. So now it's time to talk bottom line. Was the Sterling Armory sword worth the $770 price tag? Yes, most definitely. I love this sword. It's light, nimble, easy to use both one and two-handed, and combined with the scabbard, it's quite the looker. It's a fun and effective sword to use, and I'm really happy to have it. The scabbard was also easily worth the price. In fact, I think Mr. Huerta is the premier option for quality scabbards at extremely reasonable prices. I already have 3 scabbards made by him, and more planned. And that's going to wrap up this review. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing for more sword reviews. Until next time, Alien Tude out.